Hey everyone, I'm Kendrick Diaz, and you're listening to Verse by Verse. One big objection mainstream Christianity has to what I believe and to what the people behind this podcast believe is the idea that God's holy days are absolutely necessary to observe. What days am I talking about? You can find these days outlined in Leviticus 23, Deuteronomy 16, and Numbers 29. In mainstream Christian circles, they're sometimes dismissed as Jewish holidays, but in reality, they're God's days. He designed them, He instituted them, He set them apart, and He expects all His people to observe them wherever they are, whoever they are. Now, explaining why these days are still binding for New Covenant Christians would take a lot longer than a single episode. So you can go on lifehopeandtruth.com and find several pieces of content that go through this subject in more detail. We'll link some things in the show notes. But for now, I want to focus on one passage that's been misunderstood. One that many use to say that the holy days are no longer required. That passage is Galatians chapter 4, verses 10 through 11, where Paul says the following: "You observe days and months and seasons and years." And you can almost hear the disappointment in his voice. Then he says, "I am afraid for you, lest I have labored in vain." Clearly, the Galatians were doing something wrong. Something that made Paul fear that all his work in teaching them might have been wasted. The question is, what exactly were they doing? What days were they observing? It's true that the broader context of Galatians is Paul confronting certain elements of Judaism that had crept into the church. Throughout the letter, there are references to false teachers who wormed their way into the Galatian churches, pressuring Gentile Christians to be circumcised. It was a distorted version of the gospel that placed strict law-keeping as the basis for our justification rather than faith in Jesus Christ. But unfortunately, a lot of commentators make the mistake of reading the rest of the letter back into Galatians 4 verse 10. They assume that the Judaizers were also imposing the biblical calendar on the members, that the Galatians were being deceived not only into getting circumcised, but also into observing the Jewish festivals, and that Paul was warning against that. But this is where the immediate context of Galatians 4:10 helps clarify Paul's point. Verse 8, "But then indeed, when you," now he's talking to the Gentile converts, "did not know God, you served those which by nature are not gods." These members were former pagans. That was their background. Their religious upbringing was rooted in paganism. They hadn't known the true God or His calendar or His festivals. They didn't grow up making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem every year to observe Passover or Pentecost or the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, let's look at verse 9 from the Berean Study Bible. "But now that you know God, because they repented and accepted the gospel and God gave them His Spirit, or rather are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and worthless principles? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again?" So what were these Gentile converts doing? They were turning back to things they had left behind. They weren't going back to Judaism. They were going back to their old pagan ways. And in that context, Paul says, "You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid for you." The only kind of religious days Paul would have condemned here were pagan festivals. Paul himself faithfully observed the holy days and taught the Gentile members to do the same. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8, for example, he encouraged the church to keep the Passover, showing these days still had meaning for New Covenant Christians. It's also worth noting that Paul doesn't mention terms like Sabbaths or weeks or feasts, which would have been more natural if he were referring to God's holy days. His choice of words suggests he was talking about different religious observances, the ones the Galatians participated in before they became Christians. So the question becomes, why does Paul address the problem of returning to pagan festivals in the middle of a letter focused on avoiding elements of Judaism? Here's one likely explanation. Paul's readers were living within the Roman Empire, where participation in the imperial cult was expected. The Galatians were legally obligated to worship the gods and emperors through sacrifices and other religious ceremonies held on specific days throughout the year. The only way to be exempted from this was to be officially recognized as a member of Judaism, and that required circumcision. So the Galatians may have felt stuck. It would appear that some considered circumcision while others felt forced to return to their pagan practices to avoid persecution. Thus, Galatians addresses both groups of people, those entertaining the heretical teachings of Judaism and those drifting back toward paganism. But Paul makes it clear that neither option was acceptable for Christians. So did Paul condemn God's festivals in Galatians 4:10? No, he didn't. The letter to the Galatians doesn't support discarding God's holy days. They were observed by the early church, and they continue to be observed by God's people today.
Verse by Verse is a Life, Hope, and Truth podcast. Check out the show notes to find more free content, like videos, articles, and booklets in our Learning Center.